Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And thanks everyone for joining today. Purpose of this session is going to be talking about our experience porting a decades-old static website to Drupal. I'm sure there's plenty of people in attendance who have websites that could use an update, maybe wondering where to start. You've already gone through a similar process yourselves. Or if you're in the planning phase, hopefully there's something that you can take away today. Some of what we'll cover is how to plan for the upgrade, using USWDS with Drupal, empowering your users, using Migrate API on an ongoing basis, and also outcomes from the redesign. I'm Stephen Luongo. I'm the lead Drupal developer at the Wisconsin Department of Justice. This is my second DrupalCon, but I've been working with Drupal since Drupal 6. I started as a front-end developer and a site builder. I moved more into a back-end role and a DevOps role, which is kind of more of what I do today. And that's my dog, Sappho. She's a mini golden doodle.
And my name is Sebastian Zang. I am the DevOps supervisor here at the Wisconsin Department of Justice. I started as a DevOps engineer about 6.5 years ago at the Wisconsin Department of Justice. And funny enough, my primary job at that time was porting our Drupal 6 WAMP stack into a highly available LAMP stack. This is also my second Drupal GovCon, and I did go to DrupalCon in 2015. And what you're seeing is my dog Zira in the picture. Let's talk a little bit about the website. This is our law enforcement portal, which is used to provide information to law enforcement agencies across the state. It hosts job postings, certification programs, and it also hosts curriculum resources that our training academies use. This portal has been around for decades and has been a useful tool for both the Wisconsin Department of Justice and the users alike to find resources like the ones I've just mentioned. The website was built using HTML and Java, and as you can imagine, was difficult to maintain. To give you an example, the typical workflow to update this site would look like this. The website owners would email their content changes to the developer. The developer would make the updates for them in our staging environment. Of course, most of these updates were time sensitive and needed to be made the day they were sent. Normally, right, that doesn't sound like a big issue. Just make an update and it will appear on the site. Magic. Unfortunately, the site was not set up in a way to make this an easy process. The site was configured to push updates from the staging environment to our production environment through an overnight sync process. This meant that updates would appear on the site the next day, leaving very little margin for testing and validation. Things like typos, uploading the wrong file, putting up the wrong content were all too familiar and common.
And the updates would only appear on the production site if the developer remembered to push the sync button. And we know it was a terrible process. It's not just that we were having issues with our content on this old site. We also had to work with an old code base. It was written by many developers over the years and not very well documented. It had reached the point where it was difficult to troubleshoot issues, and new feature requests on the site were near impossible.
So now we have to plan for the upgrade. When you have a website as old as this one, it's really easy to keep tab on, what the limitations are and what we want to improve. One of the limitations was with updating the content, but another limitation was that the design of the site was so outdated and not accessible. We needed the new site to be 508 compliant. We learned a lot about accessibility at the last GovCon, which paved the way for a more accessible web design. We wanted to empower our users and help them manage their own content as well. Anytime they have a content update, they should be able to make that update themselves. And more importantly, no more nightly syncs. The website was more than just content. There was a lot of functionality that was written in Java that also needed to be ported. There were times where we wanted to update the old website to add a new feature or change the way something worked, but couldn't do it. Therefore, it was important to plan for a new website that supports an iterative release model and that could be sustainable for future updates and feature releases. We also want to build a site on top of a secure and resilient platform that could support updates, patching, migrations, and migrations in the future. We're utilizing load balancers, we have highly available web servers, and we also have a solid recovery model for our database. To touch a little bit on what I was talking about earlier, when I was a DevOps engineer, we're running a WAMP stack in a physical web server, single-threaded, everything on one server. If that server went down, DOJ was down. All of our websites were down. Today, we're running everything virtualized. We're 99% virtualized for all of our services. We run everything behind load balancers and security stacks. We have high availability in 2 geographically diverse data centers. And as I mentioned before, we didn't have really a tested, tried and true recovery model. We do have that now. So why did we choose Drupal? Well, we were already running other websites on it, including our main DOJ website. In fact, our main website was recognized as one of the best redesigns for state DOJ website in 2015 after we moved it. Same reason we moved it from an HTML to Drupal.
And I don't really need to tell everybody this because it's known, but we chose Drupal because it's well supported between its regular feature and security updates, the ever-growing number of websites that run on it, and not to mention it has an amazing community. Drupal makes updating our sites easy as well, such as it's easier to move a Drupal site to another version of Drupal, I should say now more than ever, than it would be to move a custom-built website to Drupal. Being a government website, accessibility and 5-way compliance is a priority to us. And that old website was not remotely close to being accessible, so we needed a way to design the site with 508 in mind. Drupal gives us an out-of-box experience that we could use as soon as we installed it, instead of the alternative, which was redesigning the site from scratch. We also would have access to verified contrib modules for extending Drupal. So anything we used from the community gave us the support that we would not have gotten if we decided to go with the custom in-house development route. We also got a developer-friendly API, making it easy for the times that we did need to write our own code.
And I think I mentioned that before, we do our own hosting. So the consideration of the infrastructure was very important to us as well. We needed to build the platform in a way that our customers could access the sites and servers without downtime. It's very critical to us because we are supporting the law enforcement community, and the law enforcement portal, the old law enforcement portal, was single-threaded in every way as well, as I mentioned. From the web server down to the database, there wasn't any load balancing, nor was there a good recovery model. Now here's the fun part. A project like this is large and needs a lot of time and resources. We had neither. We had a tight timeline of 9 months, and our team consisted of 1 developer, which is Steven, 1 project manager, and a technical architect, which I played that role. In a perfect environment, we would have had a much larger team with dedicated skill sets. And earlier this week, Brian Tofty Shoemaker outlined in his presentation, navigating your upgrade from Drupal 7, how many people you would need for a successful migration. Fortunately, we did have the right people on our team to make this a success.
So it was also important to figure out how to prioritize the work. We needed to be efficient with the time that we had. So we decided the best step forward was to get started with our site building, content modeling, and theming first. This allowed our content authors to port their content while we could work on the integrations and development tasks in parallel. It really was our project manager who helped make this plan a reality.
And Stephen already touched on that. Having a project manager is definitely key for a successful project, especially of this scale. But it's not only that. We also need a project sponsor to help keep our stakeholders in line with the project and making sure that the business units do their part during the project. Yep.
The business sponsor can do things like help instill urgency. They can keep your content authors working on the content. They can give them reason to work on that content as well. They should work in tandem with the project manager just to really keep the stakeholders motivated. All right, so for our theme, we wanted our content authors to start porting our content as soon as possible. And, the approach that worked for us was to get that theme and the content model set up first. Now, as Sebastian mentioned, we really had a small team and a tight timeline, so we didn't have a dedicated designer or a dedicated front-end developer to help with this part of the project. But we did know that we needed to find something that would look modern and help us become 5-way compliant. And this is where the US WES really helped us. It made us feel like we had our own design team. It gave us the styles and components we needed to build our site out, thanks to the predefined design system. There were things like accordions, cards, form elements, and so much more that quickly became available to us. We didn't have to reinvent the wheel. We didn't have to create the components ourselves, and it really skyrocketed our progress. There are two ways, or there's two themes that you can use to get the USWDS incorporated with Drupal. You can either use the USWDS base theme or the USWDS base Drupal theme. We decided to use the base theme, but it's my understanding that the other theme should work similarly. I saw in the USWDS session on Wednesday, there were some people out there who were confused on how to get the USWDS working with Drupal, so this is how you can do it. The themes give you a styled header, search bar, menus, breadcrumbs, footers, links, and body fields, to name a few. And then you can use the sub-theme to create your own styles and twig templates, which is actually what we did. We converted the components into paragraphs. Some of the paragraphs that we created were accordions, heroes. We have a text and image paragraph. We do columns of texts, list of links and files, and embedded content. This matched the content that our authors were using on the old platform. To convert those components into Drupal, you can do this through a combination of pre-processed hooks and twig templates. The twig templates provided a way for us to have consistent styles across our paragraphs, and the hooks allowed the content authors to make tweaks to those paragraphs. So for example, they could choose between the different accordion types, such as borderless, bordered, and multi-selectable. And you can take this approach if you'd like to do the same. Luckily, there is now a USWDS paragraph components contrib module that will do this work for you. Sadly, that had not been published when we were working on this project. Now that we had a path forward with the theme and some of the basics of our content model in place, the next hurdle was helping our customers understand how they'd be using these tools to create content. This would be the first time that they would be adding the content to the websites themselves, so this was pretty challenging for them. The USWDS and the paragraphs allowed us to create rapid prototypes that demonstrated the content authoring process. It gave the content authors an opportunity to see how this process translated into building web pages, and this user-first design led to a better attach rate from them as well. By involving them in the process, we were able to set Drupal up in a way that worked for them. We got instant feedback for what worked and what didn't, and then we could tweak the design and the tools and prototype all over again. It also took a while for our content authors how to build the pages themselves, even though they were sitting out on the demos. The demos had made the content authoring process look easy. So one thing to watch the process is another thing to do it yourself. So to get them comfortable using Drupal, we held training sessions. And the training sessions gave them a place to work through their problems and have their questions answered. And it was the key to our success. We would hold bi-weekly meetings throughout the duration of the project, and it really empowered our users to be able to add the content and use Drupal themselves. The project sponsor also helped with this adoption and was an important piece in getting acceptance from our end users. They sat in on every single demo, and also when we weren't giving demos, they were able to help our content authors manage the content as well.
One of our challenges with this project was the access to the law enforcement portal. One of the requirements was to keep the existing login and access functionality. Now, The problem here is we have another application that manages all that information, and that is separate from the law enforcement portal that we have ported here. Our business manages those accounts, and also we want to make sure that the access management remains in a single place and not have access management all over. So the law enforcement portal already had logic written to pull user information, and now we need to figure out a way to write that functionality for the new site.
Yep, because remember, we were porting from Java to Drupal, so it's not like we could just reuse that existing code base. We'd have to rewrite it, kind of looking at that old undocumented code. So this is kind of what it looked like in that old system. All this data gets stored in an Oracle database, which provided a challenge for us because we needed to figure out how Drupal could access that data. On top of that, we also needed to port all that existing user business logic from Java to PHP. So we were hoping that we could query the database using Drupal's database API, which led us to some experimentation with the Oracle DB driver module. We quickly found out that this module wouldn't work for us. It unfortunately lacked full integration with Drupal's database API and made it a non-starter for our needs. Given our small team, we didn't have the time or the resources available to get that driver working. This led us to Drupal's Migrate API. We discovered that Migrate API could be used for purposes aside from one-time content migration to Drupal. It could also be used on an ongoing data migration. Just like how USWDS fast-tracked our design, Migrate API fast-tracked our user authentication process. It provided the tools that were necessary to get data out of one system and convert it into Drupal entities without needing to do a ton of work on our own or write a lot of custom code. This changed our mentality from needing to write a user authentication process to instead creating a user sync process. User entities would be created and updated from the data set that we had from the separate application we mentioned before. We could then let Migrate API perform the importing and processing of the data and use Drupal's out-of-the-box user authentication system. So at a high level, our sync process was get the data out of the database, process the data, and then run it on an ongoing basis. To get the data out of the Oracle database, we used an API tool called Delboomi. We then used Migrate API to take that data and transform it into Drupal entities. Migrate API also tracks when records in the original dataset had changed, and then we could use Migrate API's process plugins to do things like generate usernames, set the user status, assign roles, and set field values. We used a combination of out-of-the-box process plugins, the Migrate Plus process plugins, and some plugins we wrote ourselves. We originally thought that we would have to write all these processes ourselves, but it turns out Migrate API did most of the work for us, and seemingly by magic. There was a learning curve to Migrate API, but after that curve, it's pretty easy to use. I recommend reading the 31 Days of Migrations from understandingdrupal.com, as they provide working examples and walk you through the many different use cases you may have with your migration. Then, to run the user sync on an ongoing basis, we use Drush and the Migrate Tools Contrib module. This gets triggered through a cron, and it runs at regular intervals. This means that when the user status changes in the dataset, the migration update would then update the user entity in Drupal. This will block users who should not have access, update their user roles, and change data on the user entities as it changes in our dataset.
All right, I know we've covered a lot here, and I want to talk about some of the outcomes and lessons learned for us. And I see, Wayne, you asked the question, what factors made us decide on our own infrastructure versus a cloud service? And that's a really good point, right? You need to have a robust infrastructure. For us, that decision was made before I started working for the Wisconsin Department of Justice. To have our own data centers and utilize our own compute rather than a cloud service. Some of it was cost, some of it was talent acquisition, and some of it is building in-house talent. But infrastructure is really important. Like I said, we are geographically diverse in 2 separate data centers. We have the ability to fail over between the data centers. We have a test engineer who writes performance tests for us. So we run our own performance testing. We're running through a lot of failover scenarios. So even if you don't host your own infrastructure, you use infrastructure as a service in the cloud. Those are all things to consider when you move to modernize any application. In this case, a website. It all plays a key factor. And in those considerations, no matter where you go, you should have those always in the back of your head. We also learned, having a good project plan and a good project team, project manager, and a project sponsor is a key role that drives success in a tough modernization effort as this one. It's important to have a well-rounded team, and Stephen, like I said, he started front end, he's doing back end, he's filling a lot of roles. And without him on this team, I think we would have failed in this project. The other thing to keep in mind, our IT department is fairly large. We have multiple smaller units. We have a network and security group. We have an infrastructure group. We have the DevOps group, which is my team. And we have a dedicated applications team as well. And it is so important that these teams can work with each other, because there are needs across the board for a project like this. Obviously you need a network team for firewall rules. You need help from the apps team, because we are not HTML or Java experts. So the apps team helped us crawl through this ancient code that was written by multiple developers with no notes whatsoever. So having other people with different skill sets and having access to that contributes a lot to the success of a project like this. And one of the things we learned as well is you need to empower your users. And they were really not empowered with the old site. Stephen had mentioned we were struggling a little bit, like the demo looks great on how to be your own content author and manage your own content, but seeing and doing are two different things. This is where our project sponsor helped us, engage the business, making sure, we provide access to training and give the users what they need in order to, become their own content authors. We also, with this migration, established, the correct process, I would say, of having a staging environment where we test, validate, and get sign-off. And then we move those changes into our production environment once we get those sign-off. The old system, as we mentioned, didn't really provide us with that. It's like we made changes, we had to push a button and hope for the best. Now we have a repeatable and iteration process, and we really set ourselves up for future upgrades, because now we have the infrastructure, now we have the design, we have the theme, we have so many things that we put in place with this project that other projects and other efforts can benefit from.
Using Google Analytics to measure success is really important. Something that I didn't mention earlier is on the original website, the site structure was structured organizationally. So it required our user base to have a working knowledge on how the DOJ, the Wisconsin Department of Justice was structured in order to find content on the site. So our business units would place their content under sections of the site that was named after their business unit. Part of the effort with this redesign was to completely revamp the information architecture and restructure the menu on the site. We redeveloped new sections that would make sense to our users so that they could easily find the content that they were looking for. On the old site, we discovered that people were just going to the pages that they knew of to perform the services that they intended to on the site. And once we went live with the site, we found that even though we did reformat our information architecture, people were doing the same thing. We could then look at the Google Analytics data to look at things such as bounce rate and the user flow, and use that as a justification to make updates through new features on the site once we went live with it. So we were able to have the data that showed that people were still going to their one page and then jumping off the site. And then the business, once they saw that data, could then provide the justification to greenlight the work to add the new features, to add more ways to show the content changes on the site. I'd also like to recommend when working on a project like this to think about future projects as well. Drupal makes it really easy to reuse a lot of the pieces of your projects, things through config sync, the theme, also our components, lets us reuse those on the new Drupal sites we make. So part of what was nice on this project is any work that we did, we could then carry over in the future. So we now have a new theme and an install profile, and we can get sites spin up a lot faster than we used to be able to as a result of this. It also helped us a lot with our Drupal 7 to Drupal 9 effort, because as you know, it's not a simple port, it's a full-on redesign. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, looks like there's quite a few in the Q&A here. So I'll give these a read. What were the factors that made you decide on your infrastructure versus a cloud service such as FedRAMP ones?
Sebastian, are you muted?
Uh-oh, his audio messed up.
Are there other questions while he's...
Yeah. Well, I have one just real quick. So I had no idea that this talk was going to involve USWDS. So what are your feelings on that particular responsive framework? Do you feel like you had a good experience with it?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the really big, I would say one of the more helpful aspects of USWDS are the utilities and being able to use classes to quickly set up different templates. I use it in views all the time, applying row classes and column classes and classes to the views. It makes it so I don't need to do a lot of like style updates on the back end. I just can pull what I need from USWS, and make sure that it looks consistent on the site. I'd say we kind of transformed USDS minimally. We didn't do like a big redesign using it. We kind of used it as a model and then updated things like as changing like the header color and changing the branding and going that route. For things that were a little bit more custom to our needs, we were then able to take like utility classes and use its grid system, use its flex layout, use its components, in a way that really made it easy for us to not have to do that work ourselves.
Yeah, that framework has had a lot of love in this particular Drupal GovCon, so glad to see you guys use that. Let's see. Did you already have Drupal or PHP developers when you switched?
When we switched to working on the new site?
Yeah, I'm assuming that's what they meant. Yeah.
Sure. So it was just me.
But the answer is yes. He is our Drupal PHP developer. He's our one-man army currently.
Did you have anything to add to the infrastructure question? I know you kind of touched.
Yeah,
on
I
that
answered
already.
it earlier. Yeah, it's just it was out of my hands. It's just something that we already had in place at DOJ, so we had to utilize it.
Okay. All right.
I also there was another question. Did you have a case when you realized that your approach won't work and you have to redo a lot of things you already done? And Stephen laughs, and he can speak to that first before I will add my own 2 cents.
Yeah, so it's kind of like Ross from Friends saying pivot the entire time, and that's what we had to do. And that's why I wanted to highlight the Migrate API. It was a big challenge to try to figure out how to take the existing user functionality from this old Java site that had access to the Oracle database, that had all the user authentication business processes written and convert that into Drupal. It's not just the difficulties with porting Java to PHP, it's the difficulties with interacting with a completely, like I would say, a closed source system. It was something that Drupal just, Drupal runs really well, in its stack. And it was just, getting it to talk to Oracle didn't really work as I wanted to. So, when I was doing the investigation process and I saw that there was the Oracle database driver, I thought, oh, great, like this, we should be able to use this. We should be able to write our own custom code. We can leverage database API and just take a look at the Java code and port that to PHP. It did not work the way that we thought it was going to, and it wasn't really well supported. And so it was just this big moment where it's like, none of this is going to be none of this is really going to be worth it, or if we don't have a way to get our users to sign in and view this content. And so, being able to pivot to something like Migrate API and kind of seeing what's available through Drupal and thinking creatively about how we can sort of reuse it for our needs was definitely one of those moments where it was just like really nice to have Drupal for that, and really a community behind us to kind of teach us how to do that.
Great. So there's a really great. I'm interested to hear what you have to say. There are a lot of modules in D7 that simply don't died or don't have a D8, D9 version. How did you handle it?
We did have to port some modules from D7 to D8 for this project. One of the modules was a content expiration module. I don't remember the name of it, but it notifies users when their content has become stale. You can set it at certain intervals, like we did 6 months and a year, and then it sends out an email to those users to take a look at that. There wasn't really a good module from 7 or in Drupal 8 at the time that we could use. So what we ended up doing was finding something that was similar in Drupal 7 and writing it for our own needs, porting it to Drupal 8, but then also extending it for our own needs as well. I wouldn't say that there were a ton of Drupal 7 modules that we didn't have access to that we couldn't do in Drupal 8. I think Drupal 8 does a really good job, and I just said Drupal 9, at providing a lot of functionality out of the box with Drupal core. It also is sort of having the experience of working in Drupal 8 and having gone through working in Drupal 7 and understanding the differences between Drupal 7 and Drupal 8, extending Drupal 8 using Drupal 8's API and writing custom modules ended up filling in the gaps for times where we couldn't use contrib.
Hear the heartburn in your module porting. That's tough. So good job doing that. That's a lot of work. So another good question from Wayne. Are you using a single sign-on method with your authentication?
No, we're currently not. We talked about that a little bit earlier. Our source of truth for the user information is coming from a separate application, and we sync that data and those accounts over to this law enforcement portal. One of the big challenges with a site like this is the external community that needs access to it. If it were all DOJ employees, we could use Active Directory and Azure Active Directory to get that single sign-on even for external users. But we are not maintaining accounts for 30,000 plus law enforcement users that are reaching our services here. So currently, we do not do that. However, it was something that we brought up during this project, and we got enough responses that in a future project, we are looking at federating these logins with an Active Directory and making single sign-on a possibility. But again, our timeframe was only 9 months for this project, so it was just not within the scope of this particular project, but it will be a separate effort to make that happen.
So Mark asked, can Migrate API migrate static content from a non-Drupal site?
Should be able to. It's not going to pull directly from that static site. You can use something like a CSV and build out.
I've done that myself. Yeah.
Build it up from there. I would say really take a look at the Migrate Plus module and learn, use the Understanding Drupal.com website to kind of learn how the process works, like the overall Migrate API process works. it's really cool. It's really fun. It's really powerful. Like I said, there's a lot that it does for you, and there's a lot that you can do to extend it as well. It kind of reminds me of feeds for Drupal 7, but a lot more code involved. For when you need it doesn't have a, unfortunately at this point it doesn't have a UI. So I'd say that was really tough. It would be really nice to, like with feeds in Drupal 7, you could tamper the data. With Migrate, hopefully they have something, and I think there's an effort that's going on to provide a GUI for it. But right now it's all done through module files.
Okay, great. That's all the questions I think in the Q&A. We'll give people just a minute to add some more if they're interested in asking questions.
I will say, just like about porting content from a static site to Drupal, because our site was really old, we had a lot of content that was also old. There was a lot of content that just had piled onto the site over the years. There was disparate content. There was content that said something in one place and then said something different in another place. And so it was a really good opportunity to have our content authors and our business stakeholders take a look at the content on their site and really decide what should be ported over. I'd say it's better to do that before you get started, before you even think about porting your content using Migrate API. You may find that it provides a greater benefit to have people look at the content as it did for us and not just blindly port that content over. You're more than welcome to do that through a CSV if that's something that you want to do. But when you have an old website like this, it's really a good idea to manually port your content and not automate it.
I want to just come back, to the challenges. When we had to redesign or rethink our approach, and one of the things was, how do we get the data from an Oracle database? And we had to rethink and find a different tool that could help us with that kind of data migration, right? So it's always important to look at, yes, Drupal can do a lot, and there's a lot of ways it can help you in a migration and getting data, but sometimes it's worthwhile looking at a different tool, a different product. You may already have it in your portfolio. We fortunately have an API tool already, and we just leverage that to help us with that data transformation piece. So never, it's okay to think outside of the box, especially for, a project like this. It's always good to know what else do you have, what else can you use. It doesn't have to be all Drupal.
Don't be afraid to use contrib modules and extend those contrib modules as well. We use web form a lot, and the web form handlers to do some additional processing on the site. So we have people who are filling out, our users come to the site and they can fill out these forms, and then we can take those web forms and have them create nodes. And that was just, it's really nice to be able to not have to write that ourselves, and leverage, and not just use Form API to do that, but leverage something like web form where you get a lot of functionality with it, but then you can also extend it for your own needs.
I think that's all the questions, unless someone puts one in last minute.
There's one more from Fabian. I know this is a very general question, but migrate versus feeds, which one is best?
I like being able to have the control and flexibility with writing my code, in PHP. I think that for somebody who has the right skills, Migrate API is incredibly powerful. And I think if you want to do more of a no-code, low-code solution, go with feeds.
Last year, myself and another developer gave a small talk about a Migrate-S type situation that we came on. One thing about Migrate is that you can roll back, and that is a big benefit. Feeds, you're kind of at the mercy of what happens. You're gonna have to dump your database and reinstall it again. So that's one benefit, I would think.
yeah, it's amazing the amount of stuff that we got for free with Migrate API.
Good call on using that. I think you guys, it sounds like you guys used all the right tools for this. So well done.
Thank you. And thanks everybody.
Yeah, I think that's probably time. Unless there's another question. There were a couple that snuck in. Let's see. I think that's it.
Awesome. Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you again, everyone, for attending.
All right. Thank you, guys.